Let me tell you about a cold Wednesday morning in January of 1985 in the cut-over hardwood country of northern Wisconsin, when a 76-year-old farmer logger in a patched green and black-checked Mackinaw coat drove a 14-cord load of mixed birch and hard maple and red oak and basswood into the Tannehill Lumber and Pulpwood Company yard on Sawyer County Highway B, and was paid very politely and very firmly for 9 cords at a discount tier that had been invented 2 months earlier in a Minneapolis conference room he had never seen. His name was Axel Bjornstad. Everyone in Tannehill and the 4 townships south of it called him Ox, the way they had called his father Lars and his grandfather Karsten and his great-grandfather Halvor in the long line of Bjornstads who had come down off a Cunard steamer in New York Harbor in the spring of 1912, carrying 2 leather valises and 3 Norwegian-language hymnals between them. Halvor Bjornstad had died of pneumonia in Brooklyn in his 2nd month in America. Karsten had taken his widowed mother and his younger brother Lars by rail to Duluth, and then by mailboat across the bottom of Lake Superior, and then by wagon to Hayward, Wisconsin, where a telemark cousin had a small dairy. Lars had grown up on that dairy. In the spring of 1923, with money saved over 11 years of milking cows for his cousin, Lars Bjornstad had bought 240 acres of cut-over ground a few miles east of the small lumber town of Tannehill, including 80 acres of second-growth hardwood timber along a slow creek the Ojibwe had called Nibwaka Zibi. Lars had built a log house on the property in 1923 and a milking barn in 1925, and had farmed the cleared 80 in oats and rye and pasture, and had cut firewood and saw timber off the wooded 80 every winter for 35 years. Axel had been born in the front room of that log house on a December morning in 1908 in Brooklyn, taken across the country at the age of 4, and had been working that ground alongside his father from the autumn he was 12. When Lars Bjornstad died of a stroke in the spring of 1958, Axel had inherited the farm free and clear. He had been cutting timber off the same 80 acres every winter, from October to April, for 56 winters. He had married Karen Lundgren of Stone Lake, Wisconsin, in May of 1934. They had been married 47 years when Karen was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in the late spring of 1981 at the age of 72. She had lived 11 weeks. She had died at home in their bed on a Tuesday morning in August of 1981, with Axel holding her right hand and the wind moving the white curtain at the bedroom window and a single chickadee on the feeder outside it. They had had 1 son, Karsten Bjornstad, named for the grandfather Axel had never known, born in 1937, killed in October of 1944 of polio at the age of 7, buried in Greenwood Cemetery in Tannehill. After Karsten died, Karen had not been able to have another child. They had farmed together for the next 37 years. Axel wore the same green and black checked Mackinaw coat every winter, from the first hard freeze in October to the last cold snap in May. The coat was a stormy Cromer Mackinaw, heavy wool, double-breasted, with deep, flapped patch pockets, originally olive and black plaid, bought by his father Lars at a hardware store in Hayward in November of 1952 on a Sunday afternoon trip to town, and worn by Lars for the 6 winters before he died. Axel had taken the coat from the wardrobe at Lars's funeral in 1958 and had worn it every winter since. Karin had mended the right elbow with a square of matching wool in February of 1969, and the left elbow with a square that didn't quite match in November of 1973, and the lining at the right cuff in January of 1978. After Karin died, Axel had not bought a new coat. He had no intention of ever buying a new coat. He intended to wear the Mackinaw for as long as it held together, because his father had bought it, and Karin had mended it, and because Axel Bjornstad was a man who did not see the use in buying a new coat when the old one still kept the wind off his ribs. On the morning of Wednesday, January 23rd, 1985, the temperature in Sawyer County, Wisconsin, was 11 degrees below zero at sunup, and a north wind was coming down off Lake Superior at 15 miles an hour, and the sun was a flat, pale disk over the spruce line at the north end of Axel's South 40. He and his hired hand, a 61-year-old man named Karl Erjevek, whose grandparents had come from Slovenia in 1898 to the Iron River mines, had been cutting timber off the 80 since the second week of November. They had down on skids in the woodlot 168 logs in mixed birch, hard maple, red oak, and basswood. They had spent Tuesday and Tuesday night and Wednesday morning loading 14 cords worth of those logs onto Axel's 1976 GMC C6500 truck with a 16-foot flatbed and oak side rails Lars had milled himself in 1955. They were ready to roll at 9:45. By the published Tannehill Lumber and Pulpwood Company supplier price list, last updated in November of 1984, and posted on the cork board inside the scaling shed, 14 cords of mixed local hardwoods at the standard mixed cord rate of $90 per scaled cord came to $1,260. Axel had been delivering loads to the Tannehill yard for 56 years. He had been receiving $90 per scaled cord, or whatever the equivalent rate had been adjusted for inflation for the previous 6 winters. The yard had been founded in 1898 by a Swedish immigrant named Olaf Quist, who had come north from Eau Claire on a Wisconsin Central work crew and stayed when the railroad turned south. The Quists had run the yard for 3 generations. In November of 1979, the third-generation Quist, a man named Birger Quist, who had been a good friend of Lars Bjornstad's and a pallbearer at Karin Bjornstad's funeral in 1981, had sold the operating company to a Minneapolis-based holding company called Great Lakes Hardwoods Corporation. Great Lakes Hardwoods had kept the Quist name on the gate. They had kept the same scaler, a 58-year-old quiet German-Norwegian named Mickey Sandell, who had been at the yard since 1948. They had kept the same supplier price list for 5 years. Nothing visible had changed. In November of 1984, they had brought in a new yard manager. His name was Trace Vidler. He was 34 years old. He held a Master of Business Administration from the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota and had spent 6 years at a Duluth wood products firm. He had been brought to Tannehill by a memorandum from the Great Lakes Hardwoods home office in Minneapolis, dated October the 1st, 1984, instructing him to rationalize supplier rates at the Tannehill yard, consistent with regional benchmarking initiatives. He had moved into a rental on Bear Creek Road. He had been on the job 10 weeks on the morning of Wednesday, January 23rd, 1985. Axel pulled the GMC into the truck scale apron at the Tannehill yard at 10:53 that Wednesday morning. He climbed down from the cab in the patched Mackinaw, in a pair of sorrel packs with felt liners, in a stormy Cromer wool cap pulled down over his ears. He walked to the scaling shed. Mickey Sandell was at the shed door. Mickey lifted his clipboard in greeting and started for the platform scale. Before he got 3 steps, the office door of the yard's main building opened, and Trace Vidler stepped out into the cold in a black wool topcoat and Oxford shoes and called across the yard, "Mr. Sandell, I'll handle this one. Inside, please. Phone call from corporate." Mickey Sandell stopped. He looked at Axel for one long moment. He looked back at Trace Vidler. He did not move for another long moment. Then he turned around and walked back into the main office and closed the door behind him. Trace Vidler walked across the apron with his clipboard. He smiled the careful smile of a man trained at the Carlson School. "Mr. Bjornstad, I'm Trace Vidler. Took over the yard a couple months back. Nice load. Let's get you weighed in." He climbed up onto the bed of the GMC. He counted logs. He counted them again. He climbed down. He walked to the scaling stick at the side rail. He scaled 3 logs. He extrapolated. He noted figures on his clipboard. He walked back to Axel at the cab door. "Mr. Bjornstad, I'm putting this load at 9 cords scaled, gross. Some of the basswood is going to drop us a quality grade, and we've adjusted the price tire for 1 truck owner operators without a corporate contractor agreement on file to $58 a scaled cord, effective November 1st. So your total today is going to come to $522. Let me get that to you." Axel stood for a long moment. "Mr. Vidler." "Yes, sir." "That load is 14 cords. I scaled it at 9, Mr. Bjornstad. Happy to walk you through the math. The published rate is 90. The published rate on the corkboard is what we call our preferred supplier rate. As I mentioned, we instituted a tiered structure in November. The new tier sheet should have been mailed to all suppliers." Trace Vidler looked at his clipboard. "We don't appear to have a current contractor agreement on file for you. I'd be happy to start that paperwork today, and going forward you'd be in the preferred tier. For this load, however, the discount tier applies." Axel looked past Trace Vidler at the closed door of the main office. He could see Mickey Sandell standing inside the window. Mickey was not moving. "I will take the check, Mr. Vidler." Trace Vidler smiled again. He walked into the main office. He came out 4 minutes later with a typed company check for $522, payable to Axel Bjornstad, signed by Trace Vidler as yard manager. He handed it to Axel. "And if you'll just sign the delivery receipt for me, Mr. Bjornstad, we'll get you unloaded." Axel signed the delivery receipt in pencil, the way his father had signed delivery receipts at this yard from 1924 through 1958. He folded the check into the inside pocket of the Mackinaw. He climbed up into the GMC. He turned the key. He drove the 11 miles east on Sawyer County Highway B to the farm in the long, cold January noon, with the truck bed empty behind him, because the Tannehill yard crew was already unloading the 14 cords he had been paid for as 9. He did not say a word out loud. He did not weep. He did not curse. He pulled the GMC into the farmyard at 12:32. Carl Erjavik was at the wood splitter by the barn. Carl looked up. He saw the empty bed. He saw Axel's face. "Ax! Carl! They short you. They short me." How much? 5 cords on the scale. $32 a cord under list. Karl Erjavec did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, Ox, Birger Quist would not have done that. Birger's father, Olaf, would not have done that. Birger's in Florida, Karl. The yard is something else now. What do you want to do, Ax? I want to drink a cup of coffee. Then I want to drive to Hayward, to Magnus Bergstrom's office, tomorrow morning. Axel walked into the kitchen. He hung the patched Mackinaw on the peg by the back door. He hung the wool cap on the peg above it. Idella Erjavec, Karl's wife, who had been keeping house for Axel since Karin died in August of 1981, was at the stove. She poured him a cup of coffee without speaking. She set it on the oilcloth at his place at the head of the table. He sat down. He drank it. That night, Axel Bjornstad sat at the kitchen table where Karin had sat for 47 years and pulled out the roll-top desk drawer in the front room. From the bottom drawer, he took out a worn manila folder labeled in his father's hand and then in his own hand. Karsten, MIT/INV, 1947 to current. He carried the folder back to the kitchen. He opened it under the warm yellow light of the overhead lamp. In 1947, when Axel had been 39 years old and his son Karsten 3 years dead of polio, Axel's father, Lars Bjornstad, had walked into the First Northern Savings Bank of Hayward on a Saturday morning in May with $398 from the spring sale of 3 Holstein milking cows, and had asked the teller, a young woman named Ava Nordstrom, if there was any sensible thing a man could do with a small amount of money to set against a long winter. Ava Nordstrom had been 26 years old and had a finance certificate from St. Olaf College and had told Lars Bjornstad about a thing called a mutual fund, specifically a Boston open-end vehicle called Massachusetts Investors Trust, into which a man could put a small amount once a year and let it ride. Lars had bought $400 worth of shares that Saturday morning, the way a man buys 5 rolls of barbed wire for a fence he intends to maintain for 40 years. He had added between $50 and $200 to the fund every spring for the next 11 springs, after the milk check came through, and had kept careful pencil records of every share lot in a leather notebook he had labeled in pencil on the cover Karsten, because Lars had decided in the kitchen on the night of his grandson Karsten Bjornstad's funeral in October of 1944 that whatever this small thing might grow into would be set aside in his grandson's name and given by Lars or by Axel, after Lars, to some good purpose neither of them yet knew of. When Lars Bjornstad died of a stroke in May of 1958, the leather notebook and the share certificates had been worth $11,400. Axel had kept the notebook. He had kept the fund. He had added to it himself, $200 to $500 every winter after the timber cutting season at the Tannehill yard. He had bought modestly through a Hayward broker named Hannes Lindqvist into Wisconsin Electric Power preferred stock in 1962 and into Wisconsin Bell Common in 1968 and into a Vanguard Index Fund in 1976. He had told nobody. He had not told his attorney. He had not told the new manager at the bank in Hayward when the old manager retired in 1979. He had not told Karl Erjavec. He had not told Karin. Karin had known there was Daddy Lars's notebook and that the notebook had something in it. She had never asked the total. Axel had never told her. On the night of Wednesday, January 23, 1985, The notebook contained shares in 5 mutual funds, 3 utility preferreds, 2 telephone commons, and 1 industrial bond, with a current market value calculated by Oxel that night, with a pocket calculator at the kitchen table, of $1,840,000. Axel Bjornstad closed the notebook. He sat for a long time. He looked across the table at the empty chair where Karin had sat. He said very quietly, "Karin, I think I am going to do something with Daddy's notebook." He slept 5 hours. At 7:30 on Thursday morning, January 24th, 1985, with the patched Mackinaw buttoned all the way up and the wool cap pulled down, he climbed back into the GMC with the notebook folded inside the inside pocket and drove the 22 miles south to Hayward and walked up the wooden stairs of the limestone building on Main Street to the second-floor office of Magnus Bergstrom, attorney at law, 3rd generation, age 70. Magnus Bergstrom was already at his desk in a gray cardigan. The coffee was already on. "Ax? Magnus, sit down." Axel sat in the brown leather wingback chair across the oak desk. He took the notebook out of the Mackinaw. He laid it on the desk between them. He pushed it across with his right index finger. "Magnus." "Yes, Ax. They short me at the Tannehill yard yesterday. New man. Out of Minneapolis. Paid me for 9 cords on a 14-cord load at $32 a cord under list. He told me there is a tier." "That is theft, Ax. That is what it is. And the notebook. My daddy started it in 1947 with the milk cow money, 45 springs of paper records. I have been adding to it for 27 winters. It is $1,840,000 in the market this morning. I have not told a soul." Magnus Bergstrom opened the notebook. He turned pages for 2 minutes without speaking. He closed it. He looked at Axel over the top of his bifocals. "Ax." "Yes, Magnus. What do you want me to do?" "I want to know what the holding company in Minneapolis owes." Magnus Bergstrom picked up his telephone. By 11 that morning, he had spoken to a friend at Northwest Wisconsin Bank in Eau Claire, who happened to know the senior debt structure of Great Lakes Hardwoods Corporation, having been one of 3 regional banks holding pieces of it. By 2 in the afternoon, Magnus had on the desk in front of him a rough picture. $4,200,000 of senior secured debt across 3 regional banks, of which the most distressed tranche was an $880,000 note held by Lakeshore Savings Bank of Marquette, Michigan, which had been booked at par in 1980, had been late on interest 3 times in 18 months, and had been the subject of quiet conversations between Lakeshore management and Michigan state banking regulators since October. By 6 that Thursday evening, Magnus Bergstrom was on the long-distance line to the distressed assets desk of Lakeshore Savings Bank in Marquette, on behalf of a Wisconsin nominee limited liability company called Bjornstad Holdings, LLC, to be organized that week. By Friday, March the 1st, 1985, Bjornstad Holdings, LLC, a Wisconsin LLC, with 1 member of record and a Hayward post office box for service of process, had purchased the $880,000 Lakeshore note from Lakeshore Savings Bank's Distressed Assets Desk for $660,000 in cash, wired from a Vanguard liquidation routed through First Northern Savings Bank of Hayward. The note carried a 14% coupon and quarterly interest of $30,800 due on April the 1st. Great Lakes Hardwoods Corporation missed the April 1st payment by 11 days. On Friday, April the 12th, 1985, Magnus Bergstrom of Bergstrom and Sons, Hayward, Wisconsin, on behalf of Bjornstad Holdings, LLC, sent a formal notice of default to the office of the Chief Executive of Great Lakes Hardwoods Corporation in Minneapolis. The notice quoted the cross-default provisions of the note, which triggered acceleration of the other two senior tranches if the default was not cured within 30 days. By Monday, April the 15th, the Chief Financial Officer of Great Lakes Hardwoods Corporation was on the phone to Northwest Wisconsin Bank in Eau Claire and to Itasca State Bank in Grand Rapids, Minnesota, attempting to negotiate a forbearance. Northwest Wisconsin Bank, which had held its piece of the senior debt at a 5% recovery reserve for 2 quarters, declined to forbear without a workout plan. By Tuesday, April the 30th, 1985, after 17 days of conversations conducted by Magnus Bergstrom from his desk on Main Street in Hayward in a gray cardigan with a fresh thermos of coffee at his elbow, a workout plan was agreed in principle. Bjornstad Holdings, LLC, would inject $4,200,000 of fresh capital into Great Lakes Hardwoods Corporation. In exchange for 100% of the equity, the 3 regional bank tranches would be paid off in full. The new equity would be held by Bjornstad Holdings, LLC, a Wisconsin LLC whose sole member, set out on a 1-page schedule attached to the workout agreement, was Mr. Axel Bjornstad of Sawyer County, Wisconsin. The capital injection was financed by liquidating $2,800,000 of the Karsten notebook and arranging a $1,400,000 bridge loan against the operating assets of the now-owned Tannehill Lumber and Pulpwood Company, secured by the yard's land, buildings, equipment, and inventory. Closing was set for Monday, May the 6th, 1985. On the morning of Monday, May the 6th, in a conference room at First Northern Savings Bank of Hayward, with 3 senior bank officers from Northwest Wisconsin Bank, 2 from Itasca State Bank, and 2 general counsels from the Minneapolis offices of Great Lakes Hardwoods Corporation, Magnus Bergstrom signed 18 documents on behalf of Bjornstad Holdings, LLC, and at 3:45 that afternoon, on the 2nd floor of the Hayward Limestone Building, on the same oak desk Lars Bjornstad had crossed 38 years before, to ask a young woman named Ava Nordstrom about a Boston open-end fund, the equity of Great Lakes Hardwoods Corporation, which owned 100% of Tannehill Lumber and Pulpwood Company, was transferred to Bjornstad Holdings, LLC. Axel Bjornstad signed the final closing certificate at the end of the table in pencil. The next morning, Tuesday, May the 7th, 1985, was a cool, clear morning in Sawyer County, Wisconsin, with the last small drifts of granular snow still in the north-facing ditches and the first soft green showing on the maples and the wind out of the northwest at 10 miles an hour. The thermometer at the side of Axel's barn read 41 degrees at sunup. Axel Bjornstad took the patched Mackinaw down off the peg by the back door. He put on the wool cap. He climbed up into the empty GMC C6 500. He drove the 11 miles west on Sawyer County Highway B to the Tannehill yard. He pulled into the truck scale apron at 10:27. He climbed down. He walked across the apron to the main office in the empty Mackinaw without a load behind him for the first time in 56 winters. Mickey Sandell was at the front counter. The counter was unmanned otherwise, The lobby was empty. The bell on the door rang as Axel came in. Mickey looked up. He looked at Axel for a long moment. He set down the supplier ledger. Ax. Mickey, you came back. I came back. Axel took a folded sheet of letterhead out of the inside pocket of the Mackinaw and laid it on the counter. Mickey unfolded it. The letterhead read, Bergstrom and Sons, Attorneys, Hayward, Wisconsin. The body of the letter, dated Tuesday, May the 7th, 1985, informed Tannehill Lumber and Pulpwood Company that effective Monday, May the 6th, 1985, the operating company was a wholly owned subsidiary of Bjornstad Holdings, LLC, a Wisconsin limited liability company, the sole member of which was Mr. Axel Bjornstad of Sawyer County, Wisconsin. Mickey Sandell sat down on the stool behind the counter. He set the letter flat on the wood. He looked up at Axel. Ox. Mickey, where is Trace? In his office, I expect. Mickey walked Axel back through the small hallway to the corner office, with the picture window over the yard. Trace Vidler was at his desk in a charcoal suit, reviewing scale tickets and drinking coffee from a styrofoam cup. He looked up. He saw Axel in the patched Mackinaw. He went the color of skim milk. Mr. Bjornstad. Mr. Vidler. Axel laid a second folded paper on the desk. A termination letter on Bergstrom and Sons letterhead, signed by Magnus Bergstrom as counsel to Bjornstad Holdings, LLC, dated Tuesday, May the 7th, 1985. Effective close of business that day for cause, citing in the for cause clause, material misrepresentation in supplier pricing documentation. Trace Vidler read it. He looked up. He started to speak. Mr. Vidler, I have 11 of your scale tickets and 11 of your discount tier explanations sitting on Magnus Bergstrom's desk in Hayward. They were collected in the last 10 weeks from 11 other one-truck men in the county who do not have your benefit of an MBA from the Carlson School and who did not know what to do. Magnus Bergstrom thinks a Sawyer County jury would find them material. Or you can clear your desk by 5. Take it home with you. Trace Vidler cleared his desk by 4:45. Axel walked back to the front counter with Mickey. He stood with his hands in the Mackinaw pockets for one long moment. Mickey. Yes, Ax. Your title as of today is Yard Manager. Your pay is what Trace was making, which Magnus tells me is $46,000. Your bonus structure is the regular scaler bonus plus a kicker tied to repeat suppliers, which you will calculate however seems honest to you. The scale is yours. The scale will be yours for as long as you want it. And every farmer who pulls into this yard with a load on Tuesday morning will be scaled the way you scaled my daddy in 1962. Are we clear? We are clear, Ox. Axel took a third folded paper out of the Mackinaw. It was a handwritten check, made out from the operating account of Tannehill Lumber and Pulpwood Company to Axel Bjornstad, in the amount of $738, which was the difference between $522 and the $1,260. His 14-cord load of January 23rd, 1985, should have brought it the published rate. He laid the check on the counter. Process this as a January adjustment, Mickey, if you would. Mickey processed it. Axel signed the back of the check, endorsed it to the Tannehill Volunteer Fire Department for a pump they had been raising money for since June, and handed it back to Mickey. He put his cap on. He walked out under the bell on the door. He climbed up into the empty GMC. He drove the 2 miles east to Greenwood Cemetery in Tannehill, the small cemetery on the rise above the Catholic Church, where Karin Bjornstad and Karsten Bjornstad and Lars and Annika Bjornstad were buried under flat granite stones in a single short row. He stood at Karin's stone in the patched Mackinaw. The May wind came down off the lake. The first soft green was on the maples at the edge of the cemetery. Karin. He stood for a long time. I did something with Daddy's notebook. He stood for a longer time. They short me at the yard back in January. New man. He doesn't work there anymore. Mickey has the scale. The Tannehill Fire Department is getting a pump. He stood until the wind began to bite through the wool at the elbow. I'm coming home now. He drove the 9 miles east to the farm. He pulled the GMC into the gravel turnaround. The kitchen light was on. Karl Erjavik and Idella Erjavik were at the table. Idella had the coffee on. She poured 3 cups. Then, because she was Idella, and because she had been with the Bjornstads since 1962 and had loved Karin, she poured a 4th and set it at Karin's place, across from Axel. Axel hung the patched Mackinaw on the peg by the back door. He hung the wool cap above it. He sat down at the head of the oilcloth-covered table. He picked up his cup. He held it a few inches above the wood. To my daddy, who walked into a bank in Hayward in 1947 with $400 from 3 milk cows. Karl and Idella raised theirs. To Eva Nordstrom, who told my daddy about the Boston Fund. They raised them again. To Magnus Bergstrom, who pulled it together in a gray cardigan. They raised them again. To Mickey Sandell, who has the scale now. They raised them again. To Karin. The 4th cup sat steaming on the oilcloth at her place. Karl and Idella held theirs in the air a long moment. To Karin, Karl said. To Karin, Idella said. They drank. And that, friends, that is the story of how the Tannehill Lumber and Pulpwood Company yard on Sawyer County Highway B in northern Wisconsin lowballed a 76-year-old farmer logger in his late father's patched Mackinaw coat on a cold Wednesday morning in January of 1985, and how 3.5 months later, on a Tuesday morning in early May, the same farmer logger walked back through the yard's office door in the same patched coat, handed the scaler a letter of ownership and the new yard manager a letter of termination, set a reissued check for $738 on the counter for the volunteer fire department's new pump, and drove home to drink a cup of coffee at his late wife's place at the kitchen table. The Mackinaw is still on the peg by the back door. The cap is still on the peg above it. The cuffs are still frayed. And every winter morning from October to April, until he's no longer able, Axel Bjornstad walks out under the same Mackinaw to look at the timber his father planted and let alone for a generation. And that, friends, that is the story.